Hello, and thanks for listening. To set the context for presenting my paper on the role of standard details in normative contemporary practice, I'd like to briefly mention a project of mine completed while an associate at Zigger Sneed Architects in Baltimore. The project is an adaptive reuse to transform a former movie theater into a black box theater for a small company that develops software for theater productions. The project was a significant reach for the small company, but they had bold ambitions for investing in the neighborhood and supporting the local theater community. The budget was extremely tight, and as such, so were the architect's fees. The design proposal developed within the specific context and its contingent realities. The design team assembled the contract documents through well-worn details using proven, mass-produced products, drawing from the firm's Revit template and past projects, following industry standards for their configuration and installation into common assemblies. A regional general contractor that has considerable experience with these products and their installation constructed the project, organizing the means and methods of its construction and sequencing the various subcontractors' work to create a cohesive whole. The project won an honor award from the Maryland chapter of the AIA, with the jury describing it as a humble but extraordinary renovation. Now, this project will likely not have much disciplinary impact beyond its local community, but it is indicative of much of normative architectural practice in the United States today. Since the standard detail plays a key role in this work and this type of practice, I am focusing on the standard detail as one of the architect's instruments of service that is worthy of further investigation. In the paper, I argue that the standard detail exerts significant but anonymous power in the practice of architecture, and it reveals the uncomfortable relationship that the discipline has with the actual contingencies of professional practice. First, for a discipline that typically prides itself on uniqueness, the term and concept of standard places us on uncomfortable ground from the beginning. In his book, Standards, Recipes for Reality, Lawrence Bush wrote about standards and their role in structuring our world, stating, quote, "Standards are means by which we construct realities, partially ordering people and things so as to produce outcomes desired by someone," end quote. So broadly speaking, standards are a sort of infrastructure that set constraints and boundaries for the interactions between people and things. Bush argues that inevitably standards become manifestations of social, political, and economic power dynamics. However, they do so in an anonymous way, as they usually do not call attention to the person or institution forming them. Further, they tend to become a lens through which we view reality, as in Heidegger's notion of handiness. Ubiquitous and seemingly invisible, standards can often be seen as objective and natural. As such, they continue to produce predictable outcomes, and we expect people and things to conform to them. Bush identifies 4 categories of standards, but the category of filter is particularly relevant for applications in architecture. The standard, as filter, identifies certain criteria in stipulating what is acceptable and what is not. In this way, we can think of the following examples: lumber grades and safety standards for food. Our contract documents could be considered another example of this standard. A single accepted definition of detail in architecture is hard to come by. In architectural detailing, Edward Allen defines details as a set of drawings that aid in the construction of an architectural idea, emphasizing building science and performance. The details covered in this text tend toward conventional or standard construction practices. For Edward Ford, the good detail is actually something quite different. Quote, "non-conforming, exceptional, heretical," end quote, the antithesis of standard. In discussing his 5 categories of details, Ford argues for the autonomous or subversive detail, a detail that achieves a special autonomy of its own, beyond mere motif, abstraction, or tectonic ambitions. Ford acknowledges an almost mystical quality for these details in articulating the contradiction between abstraction and animation, between understanding a building and feeling a building. He cites numerous details by canonical architects featuring exceptional materials, craft, and configurations. Rather than try to produce a singular definition of detail, Ford advocates instead for detailing. Detailing shifts the focus from a specific material condition within a building to an act, that of designing. Ford reveals his bias for the highly revered act of design in the subtitles for his detail categories, referring to the first 4 as detail as, abstraction, motif, and order and joint, while deviating from parallel structure in his preferred detailing as a subversive activity. So what can we say about the standard detail in architecture? The standard detail exerts power in defining the realm of what is possible during the design process. Standard details exhibit handiness, serving as default positions to be deployed and combined as needed, structuring how the design team works, as well as the resulting design proposal itself. Within a firm, standard details can improve efficiency within the design process, maintain design quality, and produce predictable outcomes. Some firms choose to create their own standard details, customized solutions to common design problems that can be used on subsequent projects to increase their efficiency and documentation. Other standard details are much more generic and address typical conditions that are used throughout the discipline and across many different firms. These standard details often involve a series of nested standards, synthesizing relevant product manufacturers and industry reference guides. They typically involve industrialized building products, themselves the manifestation of various standards like ASTM, NFPA, etc. Industry resources like Architectural Graphic Standards, Fundamentals of Building Construction, and Building Construction Illustrated standards themselves capture these more widely accepted conventions and incorporate technological developments into standard details. Bush asserts that, quote, power is present only when it is performed or enacted, end quote, while often derived directly from manufacturers of industry reference guides. The standard detail achieves agency in a construction project when it is included in a set of contract documents as part of the architect's instruments of service. If standard details are taught or addressed in disciplinary literature at all, they are typically relegated to technical resources addressing issues of constructability and building science. I think it's worth considering why the theoretical discourse of the discipline chooses not to talk about them. In his investigation into the history of architectural graphic standards as a social history of the profession of architecture, George Barnett Johnson notes the widening rift between the vocational and the professional identities of the architect in the drafting culture of the time of its early publication. We can clearly see this gap between the content in architectural graphic standards and Ford's discussion of details as indicative of the divide between the vocation and the discipline. Ultimately, this tension touches on claims about the professional status of architects and their claim to a particular body of knowledge. Typically, architects do not even present themselves as experts in technical aspects of construction, relying instead on product manufacturers, installers, and specialty consultants to offer this expertise as needed. In their well-known sociological investigations into professional practice, Robert Gutman and Dana Cuff note the arcane status of design above other concerns like business practices and building technology. They ultimately conclude that architecture chooses to uphold design as its master value, highlighting issues of aesthetics and artistic practice over technical expertise. This results in a preference for the novel, poetic detail over conventional building practices or more performance-driven details. However, this aesthetic preoccupation exists in tension with another standard, that of standard of care as defined in the AIA contracts. Standard of care and its emphasis on averageness seems much more closely aligned with the standard detail. Further, as Keir and Timberlake argue in Refabricating Architecture, the current role of the architect is generally a specifier or master controller. The architect merely assembles a building composed of mass-produced products combined in standardized ways. In practice, standardized approaches are often used because custom details and materials are inefficient to implement, swallowing a precious fee to design and document, which affects profitability. Further, custom details can expose a firm to liability without a product manufacturer's warranty to fall back on. The lack of theorizing the standard detail reveals the uncomfortable relationship between the discipline and the actual contingencies of professional practice. Design, as it is currently commonly taught in schools and celebrated in canonical projects, has little to do with realities that the vast majority of architectural firm projects must contend with. As the profession downplays the technical and pragmatic concerns captured in the standard detail and falls back on its purported expertise in design, it denies the incredible power of the realities of construction practices, professional and contractual liability, and supply chain realities. In spite of this often unacknowledged baggage, architecture pushes on, doubling down on aesthetics and accepting the limiting range of possibilities offered by standard products and details, while lamenting the evacuation of opportunities for design from many projects. In the images here that accompany the paper, I highlight three very common details: resilient wall base, acoustical panel ceilings, and hollow metal frames. These amplified details show the original detail in the contract documents, along with the industry knowledge and standards that they rely on for their efficacy: architectural graphic standards, fundamentals of building construction, and master spec. These standard details are ubiquitous in contemporary architecture, common in many of the buildings we occupy every day. They are adaptable systems, not the singular, perfect execution of an exceptional detail that would merit Ford's attention. Too concerned with their expertise in design, architects generally are not determining these standard details. Instead, they are created from a vast manufacturing and construction industry that has incredible inertia to maintain the status quo. This paper is the beginning of my scholarly work considering the standard detail, so in further work I'm interested in exploring the following questions. As Johnston highlights, standards can reinforce the status quo or serve as a vehicle for social and technological progress. If standard details are filters, then how can we raise a standard? And how do we determine what needs to be changed? For example, how does a particular standard detail contribute to issues of climate change or social justice and equity? How can architects move beyond more limited views of design to intervene in the much larger ecology of standard details to have more impact? While they seem natural and at hand as defaults in practice, standard details are not assumed and taken for granted in the studio and architectural education. If the Academy were to properly acknowledge the value of standard details in the discipline, architectural education may be forced to shift from the often unexamined primacy of design focused on aesthetic nuances to a broader view of design that considers the actual contingencies of architecture. As Jeremy Till argues, purity is a myth. We need more people who dare to eschew the greats and the specials and look to the everyday, the social, and the economic as forces that shape architecture. This is the realm of the standard detail. Thank you.